board. I ask you all to please remind me if I stray away from the mic or if I start speaking too quickly, because I have a number of things that we're going to talk about this morning, and I will not take it at all personally with those reminders. Debbie is passing out a copy of today's presentation. And what I will be covering this morning are proposed changes to the 401 certification that was drafted and public noticed this past July, and I will also be broadly responding to comments. Before I get into my prepared remarks, I really wanted to just take a minute to kind of tell the story, or my story, of how I believe DEQ came to where we are. And one of the things that I think is interesting to note is that for large pipeline projects that were built before these two were proposed, the Erosion and Sediment Control Program and the Stormwater Management Program rested with the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And you all might remember that those stormwater programs came over to DEQ July 1st, 2013. We adopted those regulations, or you adopted and incorporated those regulations into your regulatory portfolio in that fall. So for me, very personally, when these projects were first proposed, I was kind of like, wow. You know, I really had not participated in those earlier projects. And to the extent that we, DEQ, context of stream and wetland crossings, numerous, hundreds of pipeline projects every year. I mean, we cover sewer lines, water lines, smaller distribution lines. You know, we have always utilized either Nationwide 12, which is the Corps' general permit, or we actually have our own VWP general permit that covers utility line crossings. So I sort of had that frame of mind, which was kind of, there's something different about these projects, but I didn't really have any past experience to compare it to. And as I mentioned yesterday, we started hearing from a number of Virginia citizens and legislators almost before the FERC filings were submitted. And I came to appreciate and hear and understand that there's a lot of people who have serious concerns about the pipelines. I think at the really macro level, Virginia citizens are very troubled by the FERC process and how going through that FERC certification grants the developer a right of eminent domain. I get that, I really do, but that's not water quality. I think that there are concerns about once that pipeline is up and operating, safety and explosion issues. I actually sat through every one of the 5 hearings that we held, and I've talked to and I've heard a lot from folks, and it is, and you saw this yesterday, a very emotionally scary project and process for a lot of our citizens, and I get that. But what we're bound to do is look at the statutes and regulations that we have authority to implement and utilize. So we started thinking about, you know, where does our authority start? What can we do? And to be perfectly honest, I and all the other folks in the stormwater program had to come up to speed with a project like this in the context of erosion and sediment control. And spend a fair amount of time talking about that in my comments later on. We also were faced with, you know, how have we traditionally, as I said, permitted the crossings of wetlands and streams, nationwide permits. And we started hearing from folks not only at those macro concerns, but a lot to be sure we can protect karst resources. You know, sort of incidental to that is how do we make sure we can protect private water wells, private springs, private water supplies? What's the analysis? What's the appropriate analysis to protect water quality? What do we look at? I mean, we don't have a water quality standard for total suspended solids. When you talk about we have to make sure that this pipeline doesn't violate water quality standards. So we really started to look at what our options were. And we looked at the possibility of issuing of an individual Virginia water protection permit. I mentioned yesterday that I think the regs were actually, they would limit us in our reach. So that's why this past spring we developed and issued our guidance memorandum that is specific to large interstate natural gas transmission lines regulated by FERC. So really high, let me back up too. I went out to West Virginia summer before last with James. We contacted our colleagues in West Virginia and we said, we want to see what this looks like, in fact, while these pipelines are being constructed. It is true that a 42-inch line is a large size line, but everything we looked at actually had 125 feet construction right-of-way. So although the trench might be a little bit deeper to accommodate the additional height of the pipe, we saw firsthand construction activity in steep slopes on 120-foot right-of-way, construction right-of-way. I then came back, started thinking about what are the tools that we have, and then I reached out to our VWP folks. I sent Dave Davis and one or two of his stream restoration folks for 2 or 3 days out to West Virginia to go into the field with the West Virginia DEP staff to see restoration, how were the stream construction practices used, were they successful in returning cross streams to their natural contour. And David came back, we saw an awful lot of decent stream restoration after construction. So I don't want you to be left with the idea that we haven't thought about these things. We haven't tried to educate ourselves. We have been out in the field. We've been talking to our colleagues in other states. As I said, we're going to talk a lot more as I go into my preparation. Just really invested a huge amount of staff and effort into E&S and post-construction stormwater. But I just wanted to let you know that I might be the director of the water permitting division, but I have spent a lot of personal time. You know, a lot of times staff is up here and they kind of do the work and it bubbles up and yeah, I've got some responsibility over it. But I've spent the last 2 years looking at and thinking about pipeline construction. I have tried to keep abreast of the various court cases that are going on. One of the things that's been really tough about this is that the typical world, our legal world of how do you regulate these things and what's the state's authority and how do all these parts and pieces work together, it's been, there's new court cases every day as we go through this. So I have kept in mind, what do we need to do to protect water quality? What is the extent of our authority? Where can we perhaps press the extent of that authority to make sure that we are protecting environmental quality and addressing our citizens' concerns, and that's what we have before you today. So I just wanted to make a couple comments before I get started with my presentation. Hannah? As I did yesterday, this is just a summary of acronyms used. If you feel like you need a cheat sheet, feel free to pull it out. So we have in fact proposed several changes to the July 2017 401 certification. We have also done some things outside of that, which I'll talk about. But I think the two most important places where I want to start is what have we done in terms of revisions to the draft related to karst protection. You're going to see a lot of these things repeated in the following section where we talk about protections for public wells and springs, private wells and springs, because they really are part and parcel of a lot of the same thing. But basically, we knew that some of the activity related to karst was an ongoing effort. So one of the things, one of the proposed revisions to the July draft is that the karst hazard assessment has to be updated with on-site technical information on properties that previously had not been available to access. So we knew that there were parcels where MVP had not been able to get access to the land to actually ground truth the location of karst features. And as those issues of access have resolved, we are requiring that the hazard assessment be updated. We also included a requirement, FERC in its order revised the karst mitigation plan to include post-construction LIDAR monitoring, which is to evaluate post-construction stability in karst, and we've incorporated that requirement as a requirement of our 401. There was some conversation yesterday about how we backed off on dye tracing, and I apologize if there was any confusion, but what the revised 401 cert says is that the supplemental karst evaluation plan is incorporated. That actually is the result of the dye tracing. The dye tracing has been conducted. The report is almost final. In fact, we relied, MVP actually worked with the Department of Conservation, Recreation, and their karst specialists performed the dye tracing studies for them. So the report was called the Supplemental Karst Evaluation Plan, but that is in fact the results of the dye tracing. I think I mentioned this before and when I spoke to you guys in July, but we had heard collectively at 2 board meetings, we had citizens come in, talk to us about karst. We've gotten lots of comments about it. We actually convened a karst workshop in Lexington, Virginia. We invited our colleagues from West Virginia DEP. They brought with them a karst expert from the U.S. Geological Survey. We invited and had in attendance the Virginia State geologist who actually works for the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. And Department of Conservation and Recreation has been incredibly gracious. We have used an and cave experts' time over the last year or so. That's a gentleman named Will Orndorff. He's here if we get into some really deep technical questions that I can't answer. And I really was concerned about whether or not the construction what was the risk? What was the potential for the construction of pipelines in these karst areas to cause permanent impacts to the karst hydrogeology? And I walked away from that workshop with 3 primary things. The construction of a trench of about 12 feet deep is not, in the experts' opinion, likely to cause major interruptions of karst. Although, the first thing is you avoid karst features. That's the rule. You don't go across sinkholes, you don't go across springs, and that's dependent upon how much data you have and how you've been able to ground truth what's out there. The second thing I learned was that the real risk is that if you have accidental releases, spills, something like that, you don't necessarily know in karst topography where a gallon of gasoline may end up daylighting. So that's why we went and asked for the additional dye tracing, because we worked with Will and he said, you know, there are parts on this route where we don't have great data as to the interconnections among all this karst geology. So that was the basis for recommending the additional dye tracer studies. And it's primarily protective is not the right word. It's in advance of there being some sort of release or spill or event, that we now know who's downstream. We now know what's downstream of that karst system. And then the third thing I learned is that there is, in fact, a fairly large network of underground pipelines that have been successfully constructed through karst topography in Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Virginia. So I feel like we really reached out to the folks who know it. I am not a geologist, as you all know. I don't pretend to be a geologist. But I think that we had some really good technical discussions as to what we need to put in place to be as assured as we can be that there will not be karst impacts. Another thing related to karst is that there were some, so let's back up. Under the FERC order, MVP has to do a survey of wells, cisterns, springs, and other surface water within 500 feet of the center line of the right-of-way in karst topography. We heard from our sister agency, the Virginia Department of Health, that they would really like that survey to extend out to 1,000 feet off the center line of the right-of-way for construction. They asked that water quality monitoring be conducted, including total petroleum hydrocarbons, volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds, fecal coliform turbidity, total suspended solids, and pH. What we have incorporated into the certification is that that survey and sampling must be conducted by MVP if they are requested by the property owner and access is granted. So under the FERC order, they have to go out to 500 feet off center line. We've extended an additional 500 feet, but recognizing that access has been a challenge for some of the private parcels, we said that and they'll go do it as long as they're given access. And then finally, we've heard a lot about financial responsibility. So there are requirements in the FERC order, for there to be a complaint resolution process, so folks who believe their private water supply has been affected by the pipeline goes back to the developer, and there is a process for figuring out whether or not that construction activity has affected that water supply. What we're requiring in our state certification is a requirement that Mountain Valley has to provide financial responsibility of $5 million to support the restoration of any drinking water wells that may be impacted. You read the order. It might be a touch confusing because we talk about a variety of financial responsibility mechanisms, but we actually anchor that discussion to a different regulation of yours, which happens to be financial assurance requirements for privately owned sewage treatment plants, because you don't have a reg that says the company has to come up with this $5 million financial responsibility demonstration. So we used a reg of yours that doesn't apply, and we've put it in the certification. So if that was confusing on that, I apologize. The next couple of slides are really just some additional information as to what some of the terms are in the 401 certification that are pulled from the FERC process. A karst hazard assessment is what's actually done to identify and evaluate karst features such as sinking streams, springs, using desktop and field reconnaissance. And then I also just put a little bit of information there on the next one about what is the karst mitigation plan, and that requires field inspections prior to and during construction by the developer's karst specialist team. And the mitigation practices up front, number one is you avoid karst features. So that's kind of an overview of where we are with karst and the changes we have proposed to the certification. And Chairman Dunn, I don't know if you want to ask questions me to just keep rolling.
I think you guys can ask questions as you go along. Any questions here?
No, thank you. This is great. I had a couple of questions related particularly to the cars and I guess the dye tracing as well. The dye tracing. Has that ever been completed, or is it
Yes.
still ongoing?
So, the Commonwealth, through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, and particularly under the direction of the Cave Board, which is an advisory board whose responsibility is to protect caves. They have been engaged in dye tracer studies throughout the karst areas before this pipeline popped up, and I think it's fair to say that their ability to map has only been restricted by the amount of money they have to actually do the studies. So what we did was we asked Will, what additional dye tracing would you like for these areas? And we went back to MVP and said, we'd like you to work with DCR to do this, whether you hire your own contractor, or potentially you could actually contract with DCR and get the money to them so that Will, their field expert, could do it. So it's all done. The additional work that DCR requested has been done, but there is not, I talked to Will this morning, they're just tweaking the final report and it should be out shortly. But yes, the work is done.
Did they find any evidence of a dye trace in a karst area, for instance, pipeline one that could potentially show an impact to a spring system or well system?
A lot of what they dye tested is connected to surface streams, but again, the point of the dye tracing is to know if you show up in a surface feature, you know where it came from. So you can kind of backtrack and see what's going on, what's happened. If there's a spill, for example, there's a story, there was a situation where activity in a pipeline construction in Virginia affected Red Sulphur Springs, which is a public water system in West Virginia. If we knew where all these interconnections were, we could then contact anybody downstream and say, hey, you know, watch out, this has happened. So that was really the intent of the dye tracing, just so we could be proactive and understand how all the parts and pieces connect.
And I'll follow up on that, because I think I'm not really specific enough. Was there any that showed any connection or impact to the public or to the spring system that supported public water supply?
I am going to say no for MVP, but I'm going to look to Will just in case I'm confused. No public water supplies, thank you.
If you come up with a list, that'd be great. And I'll preface this, Will has helped me before this type of situation, where these questions are coming up.
You have to speak very closely.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm looking for is if this study's completed, is there anything in that study that is concerned, or is it something you feel like you'll need to continue to monitor?
I mean, I would say that the idea when we had the meeting in June was that were the project to go forward, and there are features along the corridor that could be receptors if best management practices failed and there was a discharge to the karst, you really need to know where that discharge goes. And like Melanie said, you know, that Peters Mountain example, you know, if they knew that that sinkhole along that corridor was connected to that water supply, there could have been monitoring present ahead of time on if the project goes forward, then we need to know this information if there's a case of a spill. Two of the traces near Pembroke went to a spring directly on the New River. It comes out at river level, downstream of the of Pearisburg. The 4 traces that we did on Sinking Creek Mountain, 2 of those go to a spring right along the Craig, Giles County line, and actually 3 of those traces went there, and then another one went to a spring down at Canoe Cave, which is in just to the east of Newport along Sinking Creek Mountain. Again, we negotiated this at that meeting for the purpose of emergency response planning. Now, there are opportunities for things to be potentially to minimize the likelihood of discharge to these features, but that was not the basis upon which the performance of these traces was negotiated.
Thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, just to keep the transcript straight with the speed limit.
Orndorff, I'm the Karst Protection Coordinator for the Department of Conservation and Recreation.
I just have one question, maybe you've already explained this. How are the sites selected for the specific karst die tests?
Okay, so part of the karst hazard assessment that MVP performed, Draper Aiden and Associates, was to go out and cover all the property they had access to on the corridor. They identified features. Some of these properties we were able to get on, and other properties we did not. It's not within our resources to go walk the whole corridor. But we went out to the places where there were open-throated sinkholes or sinking streams as identified on the karst hazard assessment report, and we prioritize those features for investigation. One of the things that'll probably come out later is, in the final routing of these things through the karst areas, these features were tried to be avoided. So these were the 6 features in Giles County that were in close proximity to the corridor that were not avoidable for other reasons. It's not like karst was the only thing I think that was being considered at the time. Now, in addition to that, I do want to mention that the year before we did those additional dye traces that Dr. Jones alluded to in the Mount Tabor area. That was done by the New River Land Trust as concerned, okay, well, we're going to move it away from from west of Slessor's Chapel to the east side. We always suspected there was water that came into that system from the east as well as from the west, but we didn't have any proof. So when the first corridor, this is back in the FERC process, came through on the northeast side of the Slessor's Chapel Valley, we said, hey, this is probably still discharging water into that system, but we need to prove it, because that way hopefully FERC will respond and have some route modifications, et cetera, to minimize the likelihood of that water getting in there. So we did 4 dye traces there to demonstrate with the New River Land Trust. They got a grant from the Cave Conservancy of the Virginias, and we provided the technical expertise to perform the traces. So there's an additional 4 traces there. So there's been 10 traces pursuant to the project. Could there have been more?
Mr. Chairman, you were here yesterday, right?
Yes, sir.
Were there any areas identified land speed yesterday as potential karst hazard areas that were not included in the dye test?
I mean, there were areas all across that, in Dr. Caston's report and the others, that we did not have features from which to do the dye tracing. You can only dye trace if you got an input feature. So you may be crossing a karst area that if you have a collapse during construction, that collapse might introduce contaminants that go affect the water supply. But if we don't have an input to do a trace, we can't do a trace. So a lot of it's a target of opportunity. Is where you place to do a dye trace from, you do it. If you don't have a feature for an input, you can't. So any of the karst areas you could have an impact, but you can't trace them all.
Well, that really wasn't my question. Some of the speakers showed us aerial photos, maps, so on, and they said there were specific features there. Springs, seats, sinking springs, whatever. And I don't know if you remember all of them or not, but were any of those thing there has been tested?
Well, the only one I know of that qualifies for that was the one Bob Jones showed, which goes into Slusher's Chapel system. And we recommended, and I think MVP even submitted some stuff to FERC back in March, suggesting getting back up away from those features a little bit to minimize the likelihood of concentrated flow. That was not in the approved final FERC document. So there's concern there still, but we know where the water goes. Yep.
Any other questions?
Wait, maybe yes.
I was going to ask about the financial insurance.
Yes, ma'am.
And actually it does relate to how the cars, like what kind of impacts you might expect. The financial insurance only lasts for 6 months after the end of construction. Is that to say that once the pipeline is operational, there would not be any potential impacts to cars if there were some sort of, rupture or leakage from the pipeline?
To address potential construction-related impacts to the karst. So that's why it's tied to after construction activity. As I did mention though, the FERC order included a requirement to conduct post-construction LIDAR, which is to then go back after construction and take a look at the integrity of those karst systems. But yes, the financial assurance in the draft certification is tied to construction-related impacts, or potential construction-related impacts.
I just want to put on the record that I worked with Mr. Orndorff in a past life and involved with dye tracing in the karst, and I want to put on the record that he was very thorough, very professional, and really was an expert in this field, and was a real asset to DC in this matter. Thank you.
This goes back to the comment about a 12-foot trench not being like in karst. Can you speak to that? If we will speak to that a little bit more. And we heard a little bit about seismic activity in the area, so can you also speak to the relatives for that?
I'm not qualified to speak about the seismic activity, and I think you need a seismologist and a structural engineer to answer that question. As far as the long-term disruption to karst aquifers, all this stuff is fractal. I mean, it's at a scale. Could a 12-foot deep trench have a long-term effect on somebody's spring? Absolutely. Could a 12-foot deep trench significantly affect overall an aquifer? I find that hard to believe. Now, that doesn't apply to stuff like up on Bent Mountain. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the karst aquifers that we see over in the valley and ridge in the thick limestone units, not perched things. Okay? We're talking about the systems that are being crossed that we consider systems. So yeah, you can have an impact, but a significant impact at the aquifer scale, where most people would consider an aquifer, is, I find, extremely unlikely. And we looked for examples, okay, in the literature of this kind of stuff. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist out there where these things have had impacts, but I couldn't find any. And I haven't seen anybody cite specific examples where such a trench has had that kind of impact. So. And that's from a water supply perspective. From a contamination perspective, monitoring and keeping long-term sediment discharge into aquifers is, critically, absolutely critical. Get a place where you have an unstable crossing that goes into a cave sinking stream. and you get sediment generated every flow event, and that thing's not stabilized, yeah, that could have a long-term impact because it's not the trench itself. It's sort of it's the surface water coming off that thing, then going into the aquifer.
Thank you.
There's no evidence of impacts to public, but you mentioned private, so I assume that means private wells could be or will be impacted?
Private wells could be impacted. With the dye tracing, mainly what we're looking at is springs, because that's where you do your most of dye tracing. You can go out and spend years and years and years putting charcoal packets in the back of people's toilet tanks and trying to chase dye up the well. It's a very difficult thing to do. So when we're looking at broad-scale subterranean flow paths, what you look at is, which spring or springs is it going to, and that's the direction of water. You try to pick up as many intermediate monitoring points as you can along the way. There's no guarantee that it's a straight line, but it's all a matter of the resource, the time that's allocated to the study to get to the level of detail. Project this scale, you're probably going to have some wells impacted. Hopefully not many. You could have some springs impacted. Hopefully not many. But I don't know how to quantify that. So.
And then my final question, and I also just want to say thank you for all the work that you put into this, and I appreciate the time and the staff has taken to provide all this information. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. We were talking about avoidance as being the first strategy, but I think I heard you say that there are 6 features that cannot be avoided at least. What assurances do we have in those areas that how will impacts be addressed, I guess, and prevented in the areas where we can't avoid crossing these features?
I suspect some engineers for the proponent will probably answer that question later, but my understanding from our view is that they're going to try to avoid discharge to these features. It's not like the feature is being filled or obliterated. It's you're heading on the upstream side of a feature. So there are mitigation measures in the karst mitigation plan and in the ENS and stormwater plans, or practices. I guess there's no plans in place yet, but they're to avoid impacts to these features. When I say they can't be avoided in the sense of potential discharge. Okay. Another thing, just for full, so you kind of get the full breadth of this. One thing that can happen in these karst areas, you can get collapse in the trench. It's unlikely, and there's a lot of recommendations the Cave Board and other people made for characterizing the subsurface using electrical resistivity, for example, which kind of allows you to image where subsurface voids are. We've had projects in the past, and the Cave Board cited this, and I'm sure you guys have read this already, where there have been, collapses in trenches during construction in karst areas. We get called out, we investigate. One of these happened in the Jewel Ridge pipeline down in Tazewell County back in 2004. It was a very significant karst area we already had a lot of hydro. We did not, fortunately, in that case, see any impact to the resurgent springs or the cave streams that we knew were connected to that. That doesn't mean that wouldn't happen. Part of the reason for the dye tracing is I've got a sinking stream at 2 places, and I have a collapse along some section of the trench between those 2 places, and those traces both go to the same spring. I can say with, some level of certainty that trench collapse probably goes there too, so.
Yes, and I don't know if this is for Melanie, but we've talked about public water supplies. My sense from testimony we heard yesterday and we've seen in our comments is that a large portion of the population along the right there is not served by public water supplies. I'm on a private well, do you have any sort of ballpark or sense of whether we're talking tens, hundreds, thousands of private water wells within areas that could be potentially affected?
I don't, but it might be that MVP could answer that. As I said, we are requiring that they make the offer to look at Springs private water supplies up to 1,000 feet off the center line. They were required to look at 150 off the center line in non-karst areas and up to 500 in karst. I don't have that figure on the top of my head as to how many they have found in that survey, but we can ask if you would like to know.
Well, is 1,000 feet a short distance or a long distance when you're talking about karst areas? I mean, my sense is that you can have transport at relatively rapid time frame for well over 1,000 feet. Is that not the case?
No, you're right. I mean, the 1,000 feet's kind of arbitrary. It's better than 500. That's the best you can say about it, I guess. But, right. I mean, the longest dye traces in the U.S. are like 30-some miles. In Missouri and Virginia, we have them up to 6 or 7 miles. Dallas County, I think maybe 4.5 miles are the longest ones. I could double check on that. So yeah, you can get pretty long transport of the dye. One of the things you have to keep in mind about this, though, is that, a lot of times that transport is sort of in a master conduit. Is tapping into that master conduit, the likelihood of a well intercepting that is, put it this way, if I have a 5-gallon-a-minute well 3 miles from a karst input, probably not being affected by it. But if I've got a well that's, cranking 300 gallons a minute, that'll go full bore 24/7, that's probably in the master conduit. All that is information to a certain extent, we're working blind on. So, the dye traces give you an idea of, people in this direction need to be notified. It's a combination of the traces and the bedrock geometry, the structure, in terms of who would need to be concerned in those cases. If that answers your question.
Thank you.
Would it be possible either from the applicant or at some point today, maybe have some executive summary of the karst mitigation plan, as well as the well survey, just hitting the high points?
Yep.
Thank you.
So, the next general area of comment and concern for which we made changes to the originally drafted July 401 certification is really for the protection of private water supplies, and it is an identical discussion to what we just had, because the connection between karst, or the concern about karst, is primarily directly related to private wells and springs. So I'm not sure.
The third quarter has additions work will be done with under a contract that we have with Virginia Commonwealth University. So we put some additional monitoring in the 401, and then we talked among ourselves and said, you know, when we look at it, what the case law tells us, a component of reasonable assurance is monitoring. So then we sat down and said, okay, what additional monitoring do we want So I'm going to take it back. We targeted sites that were critical or sensitive habitat areas. And we also took a look at a number of factors, accessibility, and then our monitoring budget. We have received requests, and a number of local stream monitoring groups have contacted us. The benefit and habitat stuff, I don't know that any of the citizens groups have certifications to do that, but we know that folks are interested in regulating stream parameters for which they have qualified certifications to collect the data for us, yes.
Were there any existing monitoring sites on this board or
I'm going to have to turn it off on that. And for the record, this is Sandra Mueller, Department of Environmental Quality, and she is our monitoring and assessment program manager.
I was asking if there were any existing monitoring sites or additional. How many existing sites do you have?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what these are.
Okay.
It seems like it's all the time.
Could you maybe find that out and send it today? Thank you.
The reason I'm taking a deep breath is because my next area of comment to address is erosion and sediment control and post-construction stormwater management. And we received a lot of